Have you ever wondered why certain people seem to rise to positions of power despite, or perhaps because of, their lack of empathy, their manipulative tendencies, or their excessive self-focus? What if I told you there's a specific combination of personality traits that allows these individuals to climb hierarchies while often leaving emotional devastation in their wake? Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating and somewhat troubling world of Dark Triad traits, the personality characteristics that often shape our leaders, influence our workplaces, and sometimes even infiltrate our personal relationships. If you've been on your journey of self-development and inner peace for some time now, understanding these shadow aspects of human psychology isn't just interesting, it's essential for your protection and peace of mind. By the end of this video series, you'll not only recognize these traits in others, but also understand how to maintain your emotional balance when dealing with people who possess them. The Dark Triad consists of 3 distinct yet interconnected personality traits: Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and Psychopathy. While we all might display mild versions of these traits occasionally, those who score high on the Dark Triad spectrum tend to navigate life with a fundamentally different set of principles than most of us. Let's start with narcissism, perhaps the most visible of the 3. Narcissism goes far beyond just self-confidence or healthy self-esteem. True narcissism involves an inflated sense of self-importance, an excessive need for admiration, and often a profound lack of empathy for others. The narcissist in your life might be that colleague who somehow makes every conversation about themselves, the friend who can't genuinely celebrate your successes, or the family member who always positions themselves as the hero of every story. What makes narcissists particularly challenging to deal with is their charisma. They often present themselves as charming, confident, and compelling, qualities that naturally draw others toward them. In the beginning of relationships with narcissists, you might feel special, chosen, or uniquely understood. They're masters at creating this initial connection because they understand what others want to hear. I remember working with a client, let's call him James, who described his former boss as the most inspiring leader he'd ever met. When he first hired me, James told me, he made me feel like I was exactly what the company needed. He'd tell stories about his successes, and somehow I felt included in that narrative. 6 months later, James found himself working 70-hour weeks, receiving criticism no matter what he delivered, and watching his boss take credit for his ideas in meetings. This pattern is what psychologists call idealization followed by devaluation. Narcissists pull you in with idealization, making you feel special and valued. But once they've secured your loyalty or extracted what they need, the devaluation begins. Suddenly, you're never good enough, your contributions are minimized, and your worth is constantly questioned. Why does this happen? Because at their core, many narcissists struggle with profound insecurity. Their inflated self-image is actually a defense mechanism against feelings of inadequacy. When someone threatens this fragile self-image by outshining them, questioning them, or even just existing independently of them, they often respond with rage, manipulation, or emotional withdrawal. As the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." This wisdom becomes particularly relevant when dealing with narcissistic individuals. Your emotional response to their behavior is often exactly what they're trying to elicit. They feed on your reactions, whether it's admiration, fear, or distress. The second trait in the Dark Triad is Machiavellianism, named after the 16th century Italian diplomat Niccolo Machiavelli, whose book, The Prince, essentially served as a manual for manipulating others to gain and maintain power. People high in Machiavellianism tend to be strategic planners who view others as tools or obstacles in their path to achieving their goals. Unlike narcissists, who are often driven by a need for admiration, Machiavellians are driven by a need for control. They're pragmatic, calculating, and willing to use deception to achieve their ends. They often have a cynical worldview and believe that manipulating others is simply the most efficient way to get what they want. In your everyday life, you might encounter Machiavellianism in the colleague who strategically shares certain information with certain people to create divisions that ultimately benefit them. Or perhaps it's the friend who seems to know exactly which emotional buttons to push to get you to do what they want. Machiavellians are often patient. They can play the long game, building trust only to use it as leverage later. What makes Machiavellians particularly dangerous is their emotional detachment. Unlike narcissists who might lash out when injured, Machiavellians rarely show their cards. They observe, calculate, and act only when they're certain of the outcome. They're not necessarily cruel for cruelty's sake. They're simply indifferent to the emotional impact of their actions on others. If you've found value in understanding these first two traits of the Dark Triad, please consider subscribing to our channel. We're building a community of mindful individuals who are committed to understanding human behavior, not to manipulate, but to protect their own inner peace and foster healthier relationships. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that illuminates these complex aspects of human psychology. Now let's move on to perhaps the most chilling component of the Dark Triad, psychopathy. Contrary to popular media portrayals, psychopaths aren't necessarily violent criminals. Instead, clinical psychopathy involves a specific constellation of traits: shallow emotions, lack of empathy, lack of remorse or guilt, and often impulsivity and thrill-seeking behavior. What makes psychopaths particularly unsettling is their ability to understand emotions intellectually while not experiencing them deeply themselves. They can observe your emotional reactions and mimic appropriate responses without actually feeling the emotions that would normally drive those responses. This allows them to appear normal, even charming, while operating from a fundamentally different emotional framework. The psychopath in your life might be the risk-taking entrepreneur who doesn't seem fazed by decisions that affect hundreds of employees' livelihoods. Or perhaps it's the partner who can hurt you deeply and then act confused by your emotional response, showing no genuine remorse for their actions. Research suggests that about 1% of the general population might meet the clinical criteria for psychopathy, but in certain environments, particularly corporate leadership, that percentage climbs significantly higher. Some studies suggest that as many as 1 in 5 corporate executives may display significant psychopathic traits. This isn't entirely surprising when you consider that many of the traits associated with psychopathy, fearlessness, charm, emotional detachment, can be advantageous in climbing corporate hierarchies. As we wrap up this first part of our exploration into the Dark Triad, it's important to remember that these traits exist on a spectrum. Most people with Dark Triad traits aren't clinically diagnosable with personality disorders. They simply display these characteristics more strongly than the average person. And sometimes, these traits can serve them well in certain contexts, which is why they persist in our population. In the next part of this series, we'll delve deeper into how these 3 traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, interact and overlap. We'll explore why people with these traits tend to achieve positions of power and influence, and most importantly, we'll begin discussing strategies for protecting yourself when you encounter them in your personal or professional life. Remember, awareness is the first step toward protection. By understanding these patterns of behavior, you're already strengthening your psychological armor against their potential impact. As we continue this journey together, you'll develop not just recognition, but resilience, the ability to maintain your center, even when interacting with those who might seek to manipulate, control, or use you for their own ends. As we discussed in our exploration of the Dark Triad traits, these personality characteristics, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, can be surprisingly effective tools for climbing social hierarchies. But what happens when these traits combine in a single individual? And how do they manifest differently in various environments? That's what we're going to explore today as we continue our journey into understanding these complex and often troubling aspects of human psychology. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Dark Triad is how these traits tend to cluster together. While someone can certainly be high in one trait and low in others, research consistently shows correlations between the 3. This makes evolutionary sense when you think about it. If you lack empathy, psychopathy, it becomes much easier to manipulate others, Machiavellianism, and to maintain an inflated self-image, narcissism. Consider someone I once knew in the corporate world, a senior executive I'll call Michael. Michael was brilliantly intelligent and could be incredibly charming when he needed to be. In meetings with upper management, he would confidently present ideas, many of which had been developed by his team members as his own innovations. His superiors were consistently impressed by his apparent creativity and strategic thinking. With his direct reports, however, Michael showed a completely different face. He would berate team members for minor mistakes, take credit for their successes, and strategically pit colleagues against each other to maintain control over his department. When confronted about these behaviors, he showed a remarkable ability to deflect responsibility and even paint himself as the victim. Michael displayed classic elements of all three Dark Triad traits: the grandiosity and need for admiration typical of narcissism, the strategic manipulation of Machiavellianism, and the callous disregard for others' feelings, characteristic of psychopathy. And yet, year after year, he received promotions and accolades while leaving a trail of burnout and psychological distress among those who worked under him. This pattern reveals something important about Dark Triad traits. They can be incredibly adaptive in certain environments, particularly those that reward individual achievement over collective well-being. In hierarchical structures where outcomes are valued over processes and where empathy is seen as a potential weakness, Dark Triad traits can actually provide a competitive advantage. It's worth asking ourselves what this reveals about the systems and structures we've built in our society. When we create environments that reward manipulation, self-promotion, and emotional detachment, are we not essentially selecting for these very traits we find so troubling on an individual level? The ancient Stoics understood this paradox well. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote in his Meditations, "The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane." In contexts where Dark Triad traits are rewarded, maintaining your ethical center often means swimming against the current. Let's take a deeper look at how each of these traits manifests in daily interactions. Narcissism, beyond just self-absorption, often reveals itself through specific conversational patterns. The narcissist might redirect conversations back to themselves. That reminds me of when I dismiss others' experiences. That's nothing compared to what happened to me. Or become visibly disinterested when they're not the center of attention. I remember sitting in a support group session where one participant, let's call her Lisa, managed to relate every other person's story of struggle back to her own experiences. When someone shared about losing a parent, Lisa interrupted with her own grief story. When another member talked about job loss, Lisa detailed her own career challenges at length. While everyone else in the group was engaged in a mutual exchange of support, Lisa was engaged in something else entirely, a one-sided extraction of attention and sympathy. This behavior stems from what psychologists call narcissistic supply, the constant need for external validation and attention. For someone high in narcissistic traits, being ignored is not just unpleasant, it's existentially threatening. Their sense of self is so dependent on others' reactions that without that constant feed of attention, they can experience what's known as narcissistic injury, a profound psychological wound that often triggers rage or withdrawal. Machiavellianism, meanwhile, often reveals itself more subtly. The person high in Machiavellian traits might present themselves as a mentor or advisor, while actually manipulating situations to their advantage. They excel at identifying others' weaknesses and exploiting them, not always maliciously, but strategically. Consider the colleague who always seems to know exactly what compliment will make the boss favor them, or the friend who somehow always gets their way in group decisions, while making everyone feel like it was a collective choice. Machiavellians are masters at creating the illusion of collaboration, while actually orchestrating outcomes that benefit them. What makes Machiavellian behavior particularly difficult to identify is that it often occurs through omission rather than commission. It's not what they do, it's what information they strategically withhold, what connections they quietly foster, what seeds of doubt they subtly plant. By the time you realize you've been manipulated, the Machiavellian has often already achieved their objective and moved on to the next strategy. Psychopathy in everyday life often manifests as a pattern of irresponsibility combined with blame shifting. The person high in psychopathic traits might consistently make promises they don't keep, take risks that affect others without consideration, or violate boundaries without apparent remorse. When confronted, they typically externalize responsibility. It's never their fault, always the circumstance or someone else's failing. If you're finding these insights valuable for understanding the complex dynamics in your workplace or personal relationships, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue creating content that helps people navigate these challenging aspects of human psychology and protect their own well-being in the process. One of the most challenging aspects of dealing with Dark Triad personalities is the cognitive dissonance they create. Because they can be charismatic and convincing when it serves them, you might find yourself doubting your own perceptions. Did that hurtful comment really happen the way you remember it? Were they actually being manipulative? Or are you overanalyzing? This self-doubt is often the result of a manipulation technique known as gaslighting, making someone question their own reality. Remember that trusting your perceptions is not just a psychological skill. It's a profound act of self-care. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that true freedom comes from distinguishing between what we can control and what we cannot. While you cannot control someone else's Dark Triad behaviors, you can control your response to them by maintaining trust in your own experiences and observations. What makes Dark Triad traits particularly effective is their situational adaptability. Someone high in these traits can present themselves very differently to different people. Charming and attentive to those they want to impress, callous and dismissive to those they see as beneath them, and strategically friendly to those they wish to use. This inconsistency in behavior often leads to confusion among those trying to understand or address problematic patterns. Consider how this might play out in a family system. A parent with strong narcissistic traits might present as the perfect, involved parent in public while behaving very differently behind closed doors. They might systematically favor one child who reflects well on them, while scapegoating another who challenges their authority or doesn't fulfill their image of perfection. To outside observers, any complaints from the scapegoated child seem unbelievable. After all, they've only seen the parent's carefully cultivated public persona. This example illustrates why Dark Triad behaviors often go unchallenged for so long. The skillful manipulation of social perception creates a protective bubble around the individual. By the time others recognize the pattern, the person with Dark Triad traits has often already established themselves in positions of authority or influence that make them difficult to confront. It's important to note that Dark Triad traits can also vary in their expression based on gender, socialization, and cultural context. Research suggests that while the core traits remain the same, the manifestation might differ. For instance, narcissism in men might be more likely to present as entitlement and authority-seeking, while in women it might manifest more as vanity and self-absorption. These differences reflect not inherent gender differences, but rather how personality traits interact with social expectations and opportunities. As we conclude this second part of our exploration, I want to emphasize that understanding Dark Triad traits isn't about learning to label or diagnose others. Rather, it's about developing a nuanced understanding of human behavior patterns that can help you maintain your boundaries and psychological well-being. In our next segment, we'll begin discussing specific strategies for protecting yourself when interacting with individuals who display these traits, and how to maintain your inner peace even in challenging interpersonal dynamics. Remember, awareness without judgment is the key to navigating these complex aspects of human psychology. By observing patterns objectively, you can respond thoughtfully rather than react emotionally, a skill that will serve you well beyond just dealing with difficult personalities. In our previous discussions about the Dark Triad, we've explored how narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy manifest in various contexts. and how these traits can provide certain advantages in competitive environments. Today, we'll delve deeper into the psychological mechanisms that underlie these traits, and most importantly, begin exploring practical strategies for protecting yourself when dealing with individuals who display them strongly. One of the most important things to understand about Dark Triad traits is that they typically develop as adaptive responses to early environments. No one is born a full-fledged narcissist or psychopath. These patterns emerge through complex interactions between genetic predispositions and environmental influences. Often, narcissistic traits develop as protection against feelings of inadequacy or shame. Psychopathic traits may emerge as emotional self-defense mechanisms in environments where vulnerability was exploited, and Machiavellian strategies often develop in contexts where more direct approaches to getting needs met were ineffective or punished. Understanding this developmental perspective doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it can help us approach these patterns with compassion rather than contempt. As the Buddhist saying goes, hurt people hurt people. This perspective is crucial for maintaining your own inner peace when dealing with difficult personalities, recognizing that their behavior, while potentially harmful to you, stems from their own inner landscape of pain and adaptation. With that understanding as our foundation, let's talk about some specific strategies for protecting yourself when interacting with people who display Dark Triad traits. The first and perhaps most important strategy is what psychologists call emotional detachment. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring, but rather developing the ability to observe interactions without becoming emotionally entangled in them. When dealing with a narcissist, for example, their need for admiration and tendency to devalue others can trigger intense emotional responses. Feelings of inadequacy, anger, or a desperate need to prove your worth. By practicing emotional detachment, you observe these dynamics from a slight distance. I notice this person is trying to diminish my accomplishment to maintain their sense of superiority. This is about their insecurity, not my worth. This detachment creates what therapists call a psychological airbag, a buffer zone between their behavior and your emotional response. It allows you to respond thoughtfully rather than react instinctively, which is crucial because reactive responses often play directly into the hands of manipulative personalities. I worked with a client, let's call her Sarah, who had a highly narcissistic colleague who would subtly undermine her in meetings. Initially, Sarah would either become defensive, which made her appear insecure, or she would over-explain, which gave her colleague more ammunition. After practicing emotional detachment, Sarah was able to respond to undermining comments with calm neutrality. That's an interesting perspective. As I was saying, this simple shift completely changed the dynamic because it denied her colleague the emotional reaction they were seeking. The second key strategy is setting and maintaining clear boundaries. People with strong Dark Triad traits often test and violate boundaries as a way of establishing dominance or extracting what they want from relationships. Your ability to calmly and consistently reinforce your boundaries is essential for self-protection. Boundary setting with manipulative personalities requires a particular approach. Be clear and specific about your limits without over-explaining or apologizing. For instance, instead of saying, "I'm sorry, but I really can't work late tonight because I have plans," which invites negotiation or devaluation, simply state, "I won't be available after 5 p.m. today." The less emotion and justification you provide, the less material there is for manipulation. Document patterns of behavior when possible, especially in professional contexts. People with Dark Triad traits often present very differently to different audiences, so having concrete examples can help validate your experiences and provide evidence if you need to escalate issues to HR or management. This documentation isn't about building a case against someone. It's about maintaining clarity in situations where gaslighting and reality distortion are common tactics. Another powerful strategy is what I call strategic alliance building. People with strong Dark Triad traits often isolate their targets, either by actively turning others against them or by creating environments where everyone is competing for limited approval or resources. By intentionally building supportive relationships with others in your environment, you create a psychological safety net that makes you less vulnerable to isolation tactics. If you're finding these strategies helpful for navigating challenging relationships in your life, I genuinely appreciate your support through subscribing to this channel. Your subscription helps us reach more people who might be struggling with similar dynamics and allows us to continue creating content that promotes psychological well-being and personal development. Let's continue with another critical strategy: information management. People high in Machiavellianism, in particular, collect and strategically use information as currency and leverage. Being mindful about what personal information you share and with whom can significantly reduce your vulnerability to manipulation. This doesn't mean becoming secretive or paranoid, but rather developing a healthy discernment about appropriate levels of disclosure in different relationships. Consider the concept of circles of trust. Visualize your relationships as concentric circles, with your most trusted confidants in the innermost circle and acquaintances in the outer circles. Information about your personal vulnerabilities, fears, financial situation, or intimate relationships should generally be shared only with those in your inner circles who have demonstrated trustworthiness over time. This leads us to perhaps the most powerful protection strategy of all: developing your intuition and trusting it. Many people who have been harmed by individuals with Dark Triad traits report that they had early intuitive signals, a gut feeling that something wasn't right, but they dismissed these feelings because the person seemed charming, successful, or was vouched for by others. Your intuition is actually your subconscious mind processing subtle cues that your conscious mind hasn't fully registered yet. That feeling of unease or discomfort around certain people, even when they're saying and doing all the right things, is worth paying attention to. As the Stoic philosopher Seneca advised, trust the judgment of your own eyes more than the talk of your ears. Developing this intuitive awareness takes practice. Start by simply noticing your physical sensations during interactions: tension in your shoulders, a knot in your stomach, a tightness in your chest. These bodily responses often register truth before your conscious mind can articulate it. By honoring these signals rather than dismissing them, you strengthen your internal warning system. Beyond these individual protection strategies, it's also important to consider the broader environments that enable and reward Dark Triad behaviors. Whether in workplaces, families, or social groups, certain system dynamics can create fertile ground for manipulation and exploitation. In organizations, for example, extreme hierarchies with concentrated power, cultures that prioritize results over process, and lack of transparency in decision-making all create conditions where Dark Triad traits can flourish. By advocating for more balanced structures, where power is appropriately distributed, processes are valued alongside outcomes, and transparency is the norm, you help create contexts where manipulative strategies are less effective. This systemic perspective is vital because it helps us see beyond individual bad actors to recognize how certain environments actually select for and reward problematic behaviors. By changing these environmental conditions, we can reduce the prevalence and impact of Dark Triad dynamics across entire systems. Let me share a personal example that illustrates how these strategies work together. Years ago, I consulted for an organization where the department head displayed classic Dark Triad characteristics. He maintained his position through a combination of taking credit for subordinates' work, narcissism, strategically sharing or withholding information to maintain control, Machiavellianism, and callously sacrificing team members' well-being for results, psychopathy. Initially, I tried to address these behaviors directly, which only made me a target. Eventually, I adopted a more effective approach. I practiced emotional detachment during our interactions, documented all communication, built alliances with colleagues who had similar experiences, carefully managed what information I shared, trusted my intuition about which projects to avoid, and maintained clear boundaries about my role and availability. These strategies didn't change his behavior, but they significantly reduced its impact on me. And eventually, by working with others to advocate for structural changes, more transparent communication channels, clearer attribution of work, and better accountability systems, we gradually created an environment where his manipulative tactics became less effective. The key insight from this experience was that protection from Dark Triad behaviors requires both individual psychological strategies and collective action to change the environments that enable them. Neither approach alone is sufficient. We need both personal resilience and systemic change. As we conclude this third part of our exploration, I want to emphasize that the goal of understanding Dark Triad traits isn't to become cynical or suspicious of everyone around you. Most people are not high in these traits, and even those who display some of these characteristics aren't necessarily trying to harm you. Rather, the goal is to develop discernment, the ability to recognize potentially harmful patterns early and respond in ways that protect your well-being while maintaining your own integrity and peace of mind. In our final segment, we'll explore how to rebuild trust and heal after experiences with manipulative personalities, and we'll discuss how understanding Dark Triad traits can actually deepen your compassion and wisdom rather than diminishing it. We'll also address some of the ethical complexities around these traits and consider how awareness of the shadow side of human psychology can ultimately contribute to greater light and understanding in your life. Throughout our exploration of the Dark Triad traits, we've examined the psychological patterns of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, how they manifest in various contexts, how they can provide advantages in certain environments, and how you can protect yourself when encountering individuals who strongly display these characteristics. In this final segment, we'll focus on rebuilding and healing after experiences with Dark Triad personalities, exploring the deeper wisdom that can emerge from these challenging encounters, and reflecting on some ethical nuances that this topic inevitably raises. One of the most profound impacts of prolonged exposure to Dark Triad behaviors, whether in a romantic relationship, family system, workplace, or friendship, is the damage to your trust. Not just trust in others, but trust in yourself. The subtle reality distortions, gaslighting, and manipulation that often accompany these traits can leave you questioning your perceptions, doubting your judgment, and hesitant to form new connections. Rebuilding this trust, particularly self-trust, is essential for healing. This process begins with validation. If you've been in a relationship characterized by manipulation and reality distortion, simply acknowledging to yourself, "What I experienced was real and it wasn't okay," can be powerfully healing. Many people find that working with a skilled therapist who understands psychological manipulation can provide crucial external validation during this process. The next step involves recalibrating your internal warning systems. After being manipulated, you might find yourself oscillating between hypervigilance, seeing manipulation everywhere, and naivety, dismissing red flags because you don't want to seem paranoid. Finding a balanced middle ground where you can remain open to connection while maintaining healthy discernment takes time and practice. One approach that many find helpful is consciously looking for consistency rather than charm in new relationships. People with strong Dark Triad traits often present an extremely appealing facade initially, but show inconsistencies over time between their words and actions, how they treat different people, or how they behave in different contexts. By valuing consistency over immediate appeal, you create a natural filter against manipulative personalities. Another crucial aspect of healing involves addressing the shame that often accompanies these experiences. Many people who've been manipulated by Dark Triad personalities feel intense shame. Shame for falling for it, for not seeing the signs earlier, or for staying in the situation longer than they feel they should have. This shame is both unnecessary and unhelpful. Manipulation works precisely because humans are wired for connection and trust. Your openness to others isn't a weakness. It's one of humanity's greatest strengths. As Maya Angelou wisely said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." The corollary to this is, until someone shows you who they are, your willingness to see the good in them is a reflection of your own healthy humanity, not naivety. Beyond individual healing, understanding Dark Triad traits can actually lead to deeper compassion, both for yourself and, perhaps surprisingly, for those who display these characteristics. This compassion doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior or remaining in damaging relationships. Rather, it means recognizing the wounded humanity behind these behavioral patterns. People don't develop dark triad traits in a vacuum. Often, these patterns emerge as adaptations to early environments where vulnerability was exploited, emotional needs weren't met, or where these very traits were modeled and rewarded. Understanding this developmental perspective allows you to see the humanity behind the behavior, not to excuse it, but to avoid demonizing people as evil or toxic, which ultimately only creates more division and suffering. This perspective aligns beautifully with the Stoic concept of amor fati, love of fate. This doesn't mean passively accepting mistreatment, but rather understanding that every experience, including painful ones, provides opportunities for growth and deepened wisdom. Your encounters with dark triad behaviors, challenging as they may be, can ultimately strengthen your discernment, clarify your values, and deepen your appreciation for authentic connection. If you've found value in this series and these perspectives on navigating difficult personality patterns, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that explores these complex aspects of human psychology and provides practical wisdom for personal growth and inner peace. Now let's address some of the ethical nuances that arise when discussing dark triad traits. Throughout this series, we've used these terms as descriptive tools for understanding certain patterns of behavior. However, it's important to acknowledge that these psychological constructs can sometimes be misused as weapons. Labels we apply to others to dismiss or dehumanize them, rather than to understand complex dynamics. The reality is that all personality traits exist on spectrums, and most people display at least some degree of self-interest, strategic thinking, and emotional detachment in certain contexts. The question isn't whether someone is a narcissist or is a psychopath, but rather how these traits manifest in specific relationships and environments, and what that means for how we navigate those interactions. Additionally, it's worth noting that what Western psychology labels as dark triad traits may be viewed differently in other cultural contexts. Some cultural frameworks may value certain aspects of what we've discussed, such as strategic thinking or emotional reserve, without the negative connotations attached to them in Western psychological literature. This cultural humility reminds us to be careful about applying these labels universally without considering contextual factors. There's also growing research suggesting that dark triad traits may have evolved precisely because they provided evolutionary advantages in certain contexts. The ability to pursue self-interest, think strategically about social dynamics, and make difficult decisions without being overwhelmed by emotion can be valuable in circumstances ranging from leadership during crises to competitive business environments. This evolutionary perspective doesn't justify harmful behavior, but helps us understand why these traits persist in human populations. It also suggests that rather than trying to eliminate these traits entirely, which is neither possible nor necessarily desirable, the healthier goal might be integration, finding ways to channel aspects of these traits constructively while minimizing their harmful expressions. For example, the confidence and vision often associated with narcissism can inspire others when balanced with genuine care for their well-being. The strategic thinking of Machiavellianism can solve complex organizational problems when aligned with ethical principles and collective good. And the emotional resilience sometimes associated with psychopathy can help leaders make difficult decisions in crises when tempered with consideration for long-term human impacts. As we bring this series to a close, I want to offer 5 key takeaways that you can apply in your daily life. First, trust your intuition. Those subtle feelings of discomfort or unease around certain people are valuable signals from your subconscious mind. Honor them by taking a pause to observe patterns more carefully before deepening involvement. Second, value consistency over charm. Look for alignment between what people say and what they do, how they treat you versus how they treat others, and how they behave in different contexts. Consistency is a much better indicator of character than initial impression or social charm. Third, practice emotional detachment without disconnection. You can remain compassionate and engaged while creating a psychological buffer zone that prevents others' manipulative behaviors from triggering reactive responses in you. This skill, observing dynamics without becoming emotionally entangled in them, is perhaps the most powerful protection against manipulation. Fourth, build and maintain strong support systems. Dark Triad behaviors thrive in isolation. By cultivating authentic connections with others who value mutual respect and honesty, you create both a psychological safety net and a reality check when you encounter manipulative dynamics. Finally, remember that understanding these patterns is ultimately about freedom. Freedom from unconscious participation in harmful dynamics, freedom to choose healthier relationships, and freedom to respond thoughtfully rather than react instinctively to manipulative behaviors. The 13th century poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Your experiences with difficult personalities, painful as they may be, can become portals to deeper wisdom, greater compassion, and more authentic connection. By bringing awareness to these shadow aspects of human psychology, you don't become more cynical. You become more discerning, more intentional, and ultimately more capable of genuine intimacy based on truth rather than manipulation. In closing, I want to express my deep gratitude for your presence and attention throughout this exploration. Understanding the darker aspects of human psychology isn't always comfortable, but it's essential for navigating life with wisdom and maintaining inner peace, even in challenging interpersonal dynamics. By developing these awareness skills, you not only protect yourself, but contribute to creating environments where manipulative behaviors are less effective and less rewarded, a benefit that extends far beyond your individual experience. I invite you to share in the comments any insights or strategies you've found helpful when dealing with manipulative personalities. Your experiences might provide exactly the guidance someone else needs on their journey. And if you found value in this series, please subscribe to join our community of people committed to understanding human psychology, not to manipulate, but to foster greater authenticity, compassion, and wisdom in all our connections. Remember, the goal isn't to become cynical or suspicious, but rather to develop the discernment that allows you to remain open-hearted while also maintaining healthy boundaries. In doing so, you create space for the kind of genuine connections that truly nourish the human spirit. Connections based not on manipulation or control, but on mutual respect, authenticity, and care. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, may you find peace within yourself and wisdom in all your interactions.